I'm Teisha Bader, and in the news, we continue to watch and update you on the situation in Israel, on the judicial reform overhaul crisis, including the diplomatic aspect with the United States. And joining us is the perfect person to talk about that, former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Danny Ayalon. Danny, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Teisha. Thank you.
So let's start with the U.S. response. I just want to mention to our viewers also, we're taping this on Thursday, March the 30th. And on Tuesday, President Biden was asked about the current situation in Israel. And he said something to the effect of hopefully Netanyahu will act and do what needs to be done and we'll reach a compromise, and that remains to be seen. And then when he was asked whether he would be inviting the prime minister to the White House, he said, not in the near term. So that's kind of a major event that happened. And then we have the response of Netanyahu, but just talk for a minute about that initial statement from the US president, and then we can talk about Netanyahu's response and how things kind of feel today.
Sure. Well, President Biden, who in no doubt, he's a great friend of Israel. I have had a chance to meet with him. I have hours and hours of meeting with him when I was in Washington, and he was a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and then sometime chairman of it. He is a real, he feels it in his gut. His love to Israel. He, even is not hesitating, doesn't hesitate to say that he's a Zionist, not just in private, but also in public. So there is no doubt in my mind that his words and actions are coming from a very, very genuine concern about what is happening here in Israel. Now, this was taken quite by surprise by the prime minister here, Netanyahu, and his people, because they were quite certain that Netanyahu would be soon invited to Washington, D.C., to the White House, maybe even right after Passover, which, we are starting pretty soon. So the remarks by President Biden were taken here, I would say, almost as an affront. I mean, this is quite unfortunate because there are so many most important things on the agenda now between Israel and the United States. Iran is just almost breaking through to weapon-grade enriched uranium, 84% already. They need only 6 more to 90%. And then, of course, it's not weaponized yet, but, it's a major milestone ahead. Then we have Hezbollah, much more brazen act. And we have Ramadan, the holy month of Islam, where millions of Palestinians go to the churches in Judea and Samaria and other areas, of course, and where they get, unfortunately, a lot of incitement, against Jews and against Israel. And then we have Hamas. And we do need to consult and to, as we have always done, to consult together with the United States and form a strategy. We need a strategy very, very badly. Now, from Biden's perspective and the Americans, they also say, we do not understand, with all these challenges that Israel have, surrounding Israel right now, as I mentioned now, why is it so important to have this legislation right at this moment in this way, such an intense, as they call it, a blitz of legislation? So I think we should, my suggestion is to bite our lips on both sides of the oceans and think rationally and not emotionally. So for Mr. Netanyahu, he has already suspended or at least stopped, at least for a while, this legislation. And I think that was a very, very important move. And now the opposition and coalition under the auspices of President Bougie Herzog in Jerusalem, in his residence, are talking about some, I would say, compromise that would accommodate all and really would fit for, on the one hand, Jewish values, Israeli interests, and the most important thing is to quiet the demonstrations and the real concern on the streets. So once, I guess, if we reach a compromise, things can really become much better, and we can charge ahead for the best interest of Israel and the United States. So it seems to me like the Biden administration's approach now is wait and see what could come out of these negotiations in the president's home in Israel vis-a-vis the legislation.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So in Netanyahu's response, we'll just go back a bit to, I think this was later on Tuesday, it seems like he's pretty much took the high road, reiterating how the U.S. Israel bond is unshakable, and that, occasionally friends, even the best of friends, have disagreements. Also saying, though, he made it a point to say that Israel is a sovereign country, which makes its own decisions, right? And then we had the White House responding to that, it seemed like things had sort of calmed down a bit, also saying even friends disagree. Netanyahu and Biden have great respect for each other. They've been friends for 40 years, etc. So it seems for now that perhaps a bit of a kerfuffle has been calmed for the moment. But as you said, it remains to be seen what can be reached through these discussions now under President Herzog. Danny, what do you think the chances are to reach some sort of broad consensus? Because we've heard the prime minister say, we're going to push these judicial reforms through in the end, but we hope to do so with a broader consensus by the people, right? And by the leaders of the opposition. So what do you think the real chances are for that to happen? And what will that look like, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, first off, Teisha, realistically, a reform with such a scope and caliber can only be pushed through consensus. So I hope this will be the case, because if it does not reach consensus and the coalition and the Netanyahu government continues to push through with the legislation, I'm afraid on the one hand, the Israeli people will continue to be torn apart, almost in the middle. And also, I'm not sure that they will be accepted by the Supreme Court, which can override. Still, the Supreme Court has the override powers. And certainly, part of the legislation is to take away some of the power of the Supreme Court. But you cannot legislate retroactively. So if these laws pass in the Knesset, the Supreme Court will still be able to nix them. And then we may have a constitutional crisis of unprecedented magnitude, because then the government may say, no, we abide by the law. The Supreme Court says this is not a quote unquote constitutional law, although we don't have a constitution, but we have some basic laws as a basis for a future constitution. And then the dilemma would be of all the law enforcement agencies in Israel and all the bureaucracy. Who do they answer to? Do they answer to the government? Do they answer to the law as presented by the Supreme Court? And I can tell you from what I can understand now and the different, I would say, advanced feelings is that most everyone here will adhere to the law. And then I'm afraid then it's going to be either a paralysis or we'll have to go to another election.
So you're saying that most people would abide by the Supreme Court ruling on this ultimately?
Yes, and we have some indications already by the chief of police and the head of Shin Bet and of Mossad and all the ministries and the bureaucracies. Yes, that this is the case, and I do not blame them, because you cannot probably change the rules of the game in the middle of the game, and certainly not in consensus here in Israel. So I think it was very smart of Netanyahu to, bring this process right now to a halt, with the hope that some consensus can be reached. And maybe also my suggestion, politics is the art of the possible. Maybe it's not the right time to push the entire reform, and you can do a little bit, little by little, and maybe wait and check to see the effect. Reforms, especially in such magnitude, certainly in the important judicial system, could and maybe should take some time of checks and balances and rechecking and examination. You see, Teisha, the reform as it has been presented now, was formed mostly, if not all, by litigators and lawyers, people of the law. So no other considerations of strategic value were taken. For instance, what this reform will do on Israel's economy, on Israel's society, on Israel's security. For instance, one of the main concerns here is that our Supreme Court, which is one of the most respected in the world because it is seen independent, has actually provided, I would say, a legal iron dome for Israel, protecting its soldiers, protecting its generals. Unfortunately, the Palestinians are trying to actually fight us in international organizations, including the ICC, International Court of Criminal Court, or in the International Court of Justice, anywhere. And right now, according to the practice internationally, if a country has a independent judicial that can investigate itself, then there is no validity and there is no need for international investigation. This has been so far, the going, I would say, way. And so that could change, again, if the international community will see that this reform takes away and actually encroaches on the checks and balances. So this is also a concern that has to be addressed. The Economist, the same way, all the Standard & Poor and other rating organizations also say that without an independent, in their mind, Supreme Court, then maybe not only, let's say, civil rights or human rights can be in jeopardy, because then the executive branch can do whatever they want, but also property rights. And we have seen already that the flow of investments into Israel has slowed down dramatically. So all these things have to be taken into consideration, and we should do it very, very slowly, very judiciously. So this is why I do hope that we will reach a consensus. And this is, if we go back, Teisha, to what is I'd say the strongest argument of President Biden of not seeing Netanyahu right now, is that the United States, their interest is also to have a broad understanding and consensus in Israel. And why is that? Because the U.S. Interest here in the region is a strong Israel. A strong Israel also represents American interests here, by deterrence, by keeping the region here more stable, less tension. Oil prices do not go up because of some skirmishes or because of wars. American lives are being protected. So there are many, many factors here, and we'll have to wait and see. Right now, the Knesset, our legislative branch, is in recess until the 1st of May. So certainly there is, I would say, almost a month to see where we are headed.
Yes, and time for dialogue, and hopefully, as you said, steps to be taken to either reach a broad consensus, a compromise, or to scale back and say, okay, we're going to choose this particular judicial reform to introduce perhaps now, and not this like blitz, as you said earlier, that was clearly not the not the approach with the most consideration of how it would actually impact Israeli society. The mass protests are really something unprecedented. Danny, you've been in Israel. You've seen things over your decades of service. Have you ever seen anything like the hundreds of thousands of people that took to the streets across the country, wrapped in Israeli flags, saying we are fighting for the country? Have you ever seen or thought you would see anything like that before?
Not ever in my life. And I can tell you, it seems like the zeal and the enthusiasm and the energy that we see here on, let's say, the liberal camp, or left and center, as opposed to center right. Also, by the way, it was not just center left people. Also, people from the right were also joining the demonstrations. And it seems like this enthusiasm we have seen before only on the right of center camp, not anymore. And that means that really the people of Israel really care about their style of democracy. And I think this is really a badge of honor to the Israeli society that people care. Look, Teisha, I compare it to demonstrations, which are, by the way, much more violent in Paris and in France. Why do the people in France are going out to the streets? Because of some benefits, because of pension age, whether to raise the pension age or not. Here, it's about values. It's about really the spirit of the country as they perceive it on the center left, and even broader than that, I would say. So, and the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are marching in the streets, violence is minimized. Nobody was really hurt seriously. The police, I think, also did a fairly good job, and keeping with the democratic rights of people to demonstrate, even in such big masses. And I think I speak with people around the world, they look at awe with the process that Israel is undergoing. And I do believe that at the end of the process, whenever it comes about, Israel will come out much stronger.
I hope you're right. Absolutely, Danny. And I would love to sort of just look sort of at the other side, if we want to call it the other side, and those who are for the overhaul and those who feel like it is something that is needed in Israel, to sort of remove politics from this equation for a moment. You mentioned earlier that some reforms may, in fact, be needed to give Israel more of a balanced spread of control over the judiciary and the legislative and the executive. So can you just touch on that for a little bit? I want to give a fair picture.
Right. Well, it's hard to refer to them as the other side. We are all on one side. This is why, it's, like a family feud. This is why it's tearing apart sometimes even families and friends. I would tell you, for one, I am for reforms. I mean, we do need reforms in the system. We have the same system for the last 75 or at least 30 years, since 91, when there were also some active reform with some basic laws that were introduced. We do need reform, absolutely. But my approach is that before any reform, as much as it needed, we need to keep the unity of the country, the solidarity of brother to brother. And we need to, unity is not uniformity. Jews would never, ever be uniform as they ever been before. Every one of us has at least 2 or 3 ideas. Absolutely. This is part of our strength, that we look at things, we examine things, we debate, we crystallize to the finest resolution, every issue, every idea. But we should do it in a consensus. I certainly believe that the Knesset could help and override the majority, so that and override over the Supreme Court decisions, but it cannot be a regular majority. it has to be a special majority.
So more
And
than 61 is what you're saying.
More
Like
than
what would
61.
you propose? 70, 80, or just?
Absolutely, absolutely. 61 is not rational. 61 is the minimum number that you need to form a government. 61 out of 120.
Right.
So you cannot just have all these powers in the government. And I know I've been in Knesset as a member of Knesset, as well as in the government as deputy foreign minister. So I know we do not have the firewall between the legislative and the executive branch as in the United States. In the United States, the secretaries, the cabinet are not members of the Senate or the Congress. Here we are. And so that's why we have to be much more careful, because basically the coalition, which has, let's say, even the minimum majority of 61, they control the Knesset. So basically what happens is that instead of having three branches, we'll have only one branch, which is the government. So I can see why people are looking at it with concern. And I say that as coming from the right of center, as one who believes in reform. But it's also a matter of proportions. What do we do? About the Supreme Court itself, I would like to see more, let's say, opportunity for, let's say, Sephardi Jews in the court. Right now, in the Supreme Court, we have 15 members, only one is Sephardi. This is a little bit odd. Certainly, we could have more. So, the selection committee could also be adjusted. But again, it has to be in a very, very judicial way to do it.
So do you think that in these negotiations now with President Herzog, if there were some reforms that were introduced, do you think the opposition leaders, Benny Gantz, Yair Lapid, would be placated by, saying, okay, these reforms would be okay, these other ones we're not okay with? Do you think there's a middle ground to be found with some of the reforms being passed in the Knesset?
Yeah, Teisha, that's a very good question. I believe so. I believe that some issues, even in the opposition, Gantz and Lapid, they say, yes, we do need reforms. That's why they are coming to talk. Otherwise, it would be a total,
a waste of time
down here of it. So yes, and again, it's a matter of proportions. So I believe that overriding of the Knesset over the judicial in the right number of a majority can be reached. The selection committee for justices is a little bit more complicated. I think that would be an issue that would be even more difficult to solve. Why? Because right now there is no trust, unfortunately, between opposition and coalition. What do the opposition say? They say, listen, if you give the coalition a majority in this committee, even for one or two justices, then it may be construed as a personal legislation for one person, which right now is in conflict. Unfortunately, this is the Prime Minister Netanyahu who stands in trial on 3 cases. So they say, it could be seen as kind of personal legislation for the benefit of Netanyahu. So this is why I believe that we need to find a middle road where everybody will be happy. No, negotiations, good results of negotiation is that nobody's happy. Everyone has to give in something. So we'll have to wait and see. I hope the people and the leaders of on both sides of opposition and coalition are mature enough and responsible enough. Because again, Teisha, I go back to what we started. We do not have the luxury of dealing with things like reforms when we have Iran around the corner.
And that's a good point, Danny. One of the songs that the protesters have been singing, and this beautiful song, Ein li eretz acheret, right? We don't have another country. This is the state of Israel. This is the only Jewish state. We need to really work to preserve it and keep everybody in a situation where there isn't this deep tear in society. And I would, you mentioned Passover coming soon, and then we have Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, 75 years. And of course, that follows Israel's Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, where the state and the people come together to mourn their fallen. These are critical days that usually really bring everyone together. So what words, what hopes can you leave us with, hoping for unity and facing these days ahead as not just the state of Israel, but the Jewish people?
Absolutely unity. And again, no uniformity. Nobody expects uniformity. Absolutely unity and getting back, an understanding that, not only we have a shared past, but a common destiny. When we say Enli Eretz Acheret, we don't have any other country. It goes for the two sides on the aisle, if you say on the political aisle. When one, everybody on the streets, in the demonstrations, they all carry one flag, is the blue and white. So we have to understand the blue and white is what really covers our entire, I would say, future. And again, I hope we will have responsible leaders that will put aside egos and other considerations, personal considerations, and look ahead for the benefit of the country and of the Jewish people.
Amen. I will say a big amen to that and wish you Chag Sameach, and just thank you so much for sharing your incredible experience, your expertise, and your very balanced and sound perspective. We appreciate it tremendously.
Thank you, Teisha, and Chag Sameach to you and to all your viewers.
Thank you so much. Former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Danny Ayalon, here with us on JBS. Once again, thank you so much, Danny.
Pleasure.
And thank you, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, managing director, Dara Golub, technical manager, Michael Paley, transmissions manager, John McDevitt, and to our producer, Carol Lilienthal. And of course, thank you for watching In the News.